Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. I'm very, very excited tonight. I get an opportunity to kind of break out of my normal mode of operation. And I'm going to be talking with Australian freelance journalist Claire Connelly. I was introduced to Claire through folks like Ellis Winningham and Stephen Hale, who you all see frequently on Real Progressives. Claire has been instrumental in giving me faith that new people are learning about the intricacies of modern monetary theory. They're giving me faith that austerity and the issues that are surrounding it are being pushed out to the public through various means and ways. I'm very, very excited to have an opportunity to talk with her because the vast majority of the people I speak with are directly economists, econometrics folks, or politicians. In this particular case, having the opportunity to talk to Claire and getting her perspective is extremely exciting. So without further ado, let me bring on Claire Connelly. Welcome to the show, Claire.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So tell me, Claire, you have written some really great things. Tell me about the article, for example, that you wrote with Ellis and Stephen, about the job guarantee. Start there.
So the article I wrote is part of a subscription newsletter that I run, little plug there, called Hello Humans. And I did quite an in-depth interview with a number of professionals in the economics field, including Professor Stephanie Kelton, who I'm sure you know was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor, Professor Stephen Keen, our renegade economist who has really gone hell for leather to start to undo a lot of these myths that seem to continue to exist despite all evidence to the contrary, along with Dr. Stephen Hale and economist Ellis Winningham. And it's called The Cost of Getting It Wrong. And it explores the economic and social and human cost of being wrong about how the economy actually works. And it deals a lot with this idea that the government needs our taxes for services to exist. It's probably one of the biggest myths that has existed in economic and political thought for some time. So the article really unpacks why that is incorrect and the cost both to the economy and to the public and private sphere and the political sphere, and how in investing emotionally in this myth, almost all sectors of the economy are being held back. You know, there is a way where almost everyone can get everything that they need and want with very little sacrifice. The only sacrifice that is required of us is to start unlearning everything that we thought to be true about the economy that we now are starting to understand is quite incorrect.
Indeed. So, Claire, given the fact that, when did you start learning about MMT and start getting involved with heterodox economics? Because this is not, let's be fair, it's heterodox because it's not orthodox. And being non-orthodox kind of puts you into rarefied air to even be digging into this. The orthodoxy oftentimes is painted with mysticism from the clerics of old, if you will. And here you are peeling back the layers of the onion, a young person, a curious person, a thoughtful and intelligent person, true. But this is not something that is for the faint of heart, because as you've already experienced, I'm sure, once you start peddling into the heterodox world, there's a target on you. People don't like what you're saying. People are, they're shocked. Let's put it that way. They don't know what to do with this information. What has been the response so far to the articles that you've put out in this regard?
There are a couple of questions in that response, so I might sort of start to unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
I'm in a kind of unique field. My background was in politics and international relations with a minor in economics, and I graduated back in 2003. And interestingly, my degree dealt with what was then really the beginning of what we now understand to be globalization and unpacking the pros and cons of free trade and open trade. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it really kind of gave me a fundamental to what the downside and what the risks were of austerity and of free trade and the contradictions that exist therein. But as you said, being a young person. I don't know what it's like over in the US, but in Australia, you have to be at least 60 years old to be able to write about the economy. So I began reporting on technology for the better part of 10 years. And I guess for me, I knew that I could see that there was a second tech wave on the horizon back in 2003, 2004. And I knew that media was going through what I could generously describe as an apocalypse. So I recognized that perhaps there might be a little bit of security in reporting on tech relative to other forms of reporting, because it was a new field that was beginning to impact almost all levels of political and economic, really all aspects of our lives. And I also understood that it was going to play a huge and significant role in policy. And, I don't know how familiar you are with the tech reporting space, but you have to be on your A game. If you get even the slightest thing wrong, the consequences are dire, to say the least. So, it makes sure that the research that I'm doing and that the way that I'm reporting is not only accurate, but unquestionable. So I did that for the better part of 10 years. Over here in Australia, we had the rollout of things like the NBN, the National Broadband Network, which has been one disaster after the other. We've had, obviously since that time, there have been issues like the Edward Snowden leaks, a better understanding of the role that our intelligence communities play. Certainly there has been a significant rollback of rights to privacy through regulation. So it really allowed me to kind of dig into the meat and bones of technology, and that kind of naturally lends itself to economics. And I have always approached my work in a very economic way. My brain kind of goes like this. Why are things the way that they are? How did they come to be that way? Do they have to be this way? What are the alternatives and what are the barriers to that? And no matter what it is that I've been reporting on, that's basically the framework that I apply to all of my work. But when Donald Trump got elected, it became clear to me that I was basically on the sidelines of history, and I had a really great opportunity. All of a sudden, my Bachelor of International Studies had new value again, because it was like everything that I had studied coming home to roost. So it was kind of a now or never type situation. And, I'll be honest, I was growing a little weary of the technology field. It's incredibly competitive. It's quite cliquey. It's a little bit narky, if I'm being, from saying things that are underestimating. It's a really tough space to be in. And, I just felt like I was beginning to repeat myself ad nauseum, and it wasn't what I really wanted to be focusing on. I've been freelancing for 6 years, and freelance is a really, really tough slog. And my dad was like, write a book. Why don't you write a book? It'll give you something to focus on when it's quiet. And so I've basically been working on that for the better part of a year and a half. And it really immersed myself in heterodox economics and starting to unpack, like, how the hell did we get here? Like, almost everything that we thought to be true about how the economy works and how the world works, it's really starting to prove itself to be mythical. And it is our investment in these myths that is keeping the system going. I think one of the most frustrating things for me after Trump was elected, a lot of, experts and sources of mine would say things like, but the market has rallied. The stock market has actually gone up since he's been elected. Sure, it took a minor plunge, but now it's going back up. So investors are confident. So that must mean that it's okay. And as we all know, the stock market and investment has almost nothing to do with numbers and almost nothing to do with money, and everything to do with psychology and emotion. And so I really started to get interested in what happens when we emotionally invest in things that are not quite true. And so I have been very blessed. Both Professor Stephen Keen and Dr. Stephen Hale have taken me under their wing and have sort of acted like mentors for me, and have really bolstered me professionally. I mean, basically, Steve Keen, bless his heart, got me my job at Renegade. And, I've basically been going hell for leather ever since.
That's fantastic. I got to tell you, I'm beyond excited about just the associations. I mean, so this is a male-dominated field also over here when it comes to the economic side. We've got a couple women that stand out, but it is largely male. And worse yet, it's largely white. We don't have a lot of diversity in general in this field. And we want desperately to pull in as much diversity as possible, because what you've just stated is probably the most eloquently stated perspective of the myth that we live under that I've heard yet. People have become invested in lies. They don't know their lies maybe, or maybe they do know their lies, but they don't have the strength or stamina to fight swim against the current, whatever it is, and then they ultimately just go with the flow, and the myth becomes reality. Have you seen, now that your eyes are open to heterodox economics, in particular, I would say MMT and MCT, have you begun to start to analyze the world through the lens of MMT and MCT?
Yes, absolutely. But I'd like to think that I'm examining it through a number of different lenses. I think it's fair to say that all strains of economic thought have their flaws, and they have their positive elements as well. So I think it's really, what troubles me is that there are a group of people who are really scared and anxious. They haven't had a pay rise in 15 years. Their money isn't going as far as it is. And then there are people, like us who, study modern monetary theory and heterodox economics, who are already frustrated with people who don't understand how things work, but it's our job to help them understand. And there seems to be a militancy between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and I don't think that that is going to do anyone any favors. I think it's important to understand that there are virtues to be found in all strains of economic thought, and I'm very uncomfortable with putting myself in a particular camp. My job is to explain how the world works and to try to help people unlearn myths that they've been clinging to. Does that mean that orthodoxy is 100% wrong? No, but it's also not 100% right. But I think it's really important for people across economic fields to start to come and work together and start to talk to people outside of their sphere, because not a lot of people have the time like we do to just immerse ourselves in this kind of research. And when you're just trying to put food on the table and, the only access you have is to, your standard news organizations, and maybe you're doing some hunting around on your own on the internet. But it's really hard if you're not across it to immerse yourself and know even where to look for it. And there's a lot of content right now that exists about the economy, and a lot of it is inaccurate. But, if you're not in it, it's very hard to tell the difference, because, a lot of it seems to make sense on paper. And if you don't have an understanding of history, and you don't understand the difference between causality and causality, it becomes very difficult to start to unpack these things. So I think instead of getting frustrated, I think we need to take a step back and recognize that, this is just the beginning for a lot of people. And while, there might be some frustration in economic fields, I think we really need to put that aside, and we need to start to exist for the people whose lives are impacted by this. So we talk a lot about inequality, and we talk a lot about austerity, but, from my research, there's a lot of time spent just arguing with each other on the internet, particularly about what language we use and how to talk to people about it. And I think we'd just be better off talking not to each other, but to people who are not within our field.
Very, very interesting. I want to say this. One of the things that we have been picking up on as we go through this here at Real Progressives and amongst the other economists, we sit there and we discuss the fact that there's groups out there such as Fix the Debt, and other austerity-based organizations that are literally pushing the narrative that the United States is broke, or that England is broke, or that Australia is broke. And so they naturally go ahead and start cutting public space, public safety nets, public services that directly impact the least capable of surviving those cuts. So when people like myself grow animated and we focus largely on these things, where we're at right now is we're looking and saying these people don't have a voice. Not only don't they have a voice, and I'm going to get to your topic here in a second, but they can't even get quality media to speak about their plight. The media has a narrative, and it's pretty much standard. I get several aggregator news sources that I read through in the mornings just to make sure I'm on point and so forth. And sadly, it doesn't matter what publication it is, the stories are the same. The angle is largely the same. There's very few, profound articles. Most of them are largely the same information said maybe slightly differently, but nobody's coming at it from an angle of austerity is a lie. There is no reason for austerity. And when you read these things and you recognize that this is what millions and millions of people are reading, and then you look around and you realize that maybe 50s and 100s are reading the truth or reading the other angle that is about saving lives, it's no wonder people are literally dying. People are destitute. Grenfell Towers, use that as a primary example. Dr. Hale spoke to us about that the other night. How do we break through the mainstream narrative that diminishes the pain and suffering and literally puts you onto a false trail as to the reason for it? How do we penetrate that, Claire?
I think, first of all, we need to be really careful when we say things like MSM or mainstream media. We are not all part of one all-thinking, all-knowing, amorphous mass. There are different publications that come to things from different angles. I agree with you that, for the most part, the economic narrative, at least, does seem to be a little the same across the board. But, there are examples. Like, for example, I wrote a piece for the ABC, which is Australia's public broadcaster, which really unpacks all of these myths, and they're one of Australia's, MSM, and yet they still publish my piece. So, let's not paint them all with the same brush. That being said, we at Renegade Inc. are hoping to be the publication that people could go to and recognize as the publication that stands apart from a lot of the others and begins to unpack all of these myths and help people to understand and see the world as it actually is instead of the way that they're being told that it works. We are still in the process of putting together our editorial strategy. I think I've really only held the job for about 3 weeks, so I would ask for people's patience while we start to commission content. But there are still some really great stories up there. I wrote a piece about the history of neoliberalism called, am I allowed to swear on this show?
Absolutely. Rock it out.
Okay. It's called What the Fuck is Happening? A History. And you can find that on Renegade Inc. And that really unpacks how we got here. It examines the role that America has played in staging coups all over the world, not to spread democracy, but to try and attempt to set up free trade zones, and for the most part have failed. And that looks at everything starting with the Allende assassination in Chile. It goes through to explain what Iraq was, which was not to do with democracy or terror or even weapons of mass destruction, but to set up a free trade zone across the Middle East, which has failed. And now we find ourselves in even more treacherous waters because of the fallout from that. It looks at areas like Russia, Afghanistan, Brazil, and then, of course, Australia, the UK, the US. And it really, it goes all the way back to 1946 and goes through right up until today. So if people are looking for a comprehensive understanding of how the hell we got here, that would be a really good place to start. In terms of how we unpack this economic narrative, I just think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of patience. And I think we need to try and be where people are at. And that's where I think that Real Progressives has a real role to play. I don't think that we can expect for people to just go to a website or just go to Facebook or just go to Twitter or Snapchat. We need to be everywhere. And we need to, as you said, you mentioned before, this field is largely white, and that's really problematic to me because a lot of what is happening right now, I don't necessarily feel like I have the right to write about, because I'm not living in Afghanistan and I'm not living in Iraq and I'm not living in Russia. And it would be disingenuous of me, and so many Western outlets do this, is that they go and they find an expert and they get a 15-minute interview and then they write that into a broader narrative. And while sure, it might be factually correct and it might go some way towards addressing the problem, I think it's really important that we start to let the people in these countries speak for themselves. And at Renegade Inc., we are invested in having writers on every continent in the globe, experts, civilians, researchers. It's really important to combine the theory and the economics of what is happening with the actual human impact. And if we keep speaking to people outside of the West, it's going to continue to perpetuate the same problem. So I would invite people who are living, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Chile, India, Pakistan, China, wherever, we need these people to start to speak for themselves, and we need to stop this East-West media divide. Everything that is happening around the world impacts everything else. The butterfly effect is coming home to roost. So if you think that the Grenfell fire doesn't affect you because you're in the US, you've got another thing coming. It all comes from the same theory of austerity, which is that, in a nutshell, the rhetoric around it is we need to help people help themselves, which is a way of saying you're on your own, buddy. The theory believes that if we spend public services and if we have a social safety net, that it's actually going to discourage people from finding work and discourage people from supporting themselves. And, in Australia, we've had this brutal rhetoric of lifters and leaners. And our government, the Liberal government, which ironically is the American equivalent of the Republican Party, have floated the idea of for people who are on welfare, they have to go to a certain amount of job applications and interviews every week, but they floated the idea of you have to accept whatever job is offered to you. It doesn't matter what it pays, it doesn't matter where it is, how many hours it has, whether there is any benefit, whether you get things like superannuation, which I guess is a bit like a 401k in the US. They're told that they don't have the right to assess the validity of that job for their needs. Thankfully, they have not yet been successful in implementing this, but they've been trying for the better part of this government for the better part of 5 years, but, we've had Liberal governments for the better part of almost 15, 20 years that have floated similar ideas. And the thing is, you can't go and get a job if jobs don't exist. And the thing that we're starting to realize now is you can't create jobs without public spending.
Amen.
And spending doesn't leave a debt for future generations. If it does, you're doing something really, really wrong. Good public spending should pay for itself almost immediately. It creates the infrastructure, it creates the industries that then generates jobs and employment that allows people to support themselves. If the jobs don't exist, what are you supposed to do? And the irony of this is, in Australia at least, we have both a superannuation system, or a 401k, and we also have pensions. Superannuation was implemented in the late 80s, early 90s with the intention of replacing pensions. And that is, in Australia, employers are required to pay between 9 and 12% of your salary into a superannuation account, which you cannot touch until you retire. The money in that account is then invested on the stock market, and it is meant to basically build up a nest egg, which you will then live off in retirement. Unfortunately, the system hasn't worked quite the way that it was intended to, and so pensions have increased over time, not decreased. And now, with the casualization of the workforce, the fact that wages have not only been flat, but have been going backwards for the better part of 15 years, it means that more and more people are going to rely on the pension system later in life. So by refusing to invest in public spending now, the government will end up spending more in the long run, supporting people in their retirement, because they didn't have the tenacity or the balls to put the money where it needed to be in the first place so that people didn't have to rely on the public purse later in life. Like, it's this catch-22 situation. So we really need to start unpacking why are we continuing along this path? If you want people to support themselves, they need to have a job. And I think most people would agree that they would prefer not to rely on the government. You know, the idea that there are just these people that just want to sit around and surf all day and not work is, you know, such a myth. You know, in Australia, there's been this very aggressive rhetoric against millennials and young people and how lazy and unmotivated we are. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, most people my age and younger are working 2 or 3 jobs. They have a side hustle that they're working on, which is their passion project. Plus, they've got 2 or 3 forms of employment. You know, I'm a freelancer. I have about 25 different forms of income, and I'm reliant on every single one of those forms of income. And if any one of those disappears, it is a problem. You know, so assuming that we're just sitting all around watching Netflix is a myth in the first place. I believe that millennials are some of the most tenacious and adaptable workers in the marketplace. And I can't believe that we're not doing more to support their skills and their growth. But across industries, and this isn't just for young people, IT, finance, media, you know, even across trades, training and management have been cut from the mid-level of businesses. Because I guess what's happened is after the GFC, there has been no true economic recovery, and workplaces and companies and business are finding themselves in the position of cutting costs to drive profit because their products aren't doing the job that they're meant to do and their services aren't bringing in the profit that they're meant to do. So the only thing that you can do is keep cutting away at your business until you go back into black. And that's not really a long-term business strategy, because eventually you cut and you cut and you cut, or you don't have a company anymore because there's nothing left. But you know, I was speaking to a girl the other day. She works for a major international conglomerate. She's 29 years old. She deals with millions of dollars a day from oil companies and gas companies, and she's never received a day of training. Everything that she has learnt in the job, she has just picked up as she's gone. And now when you're looking at things like IT security, for example, you know, we just recently had the incident of WannaCry, where ransomware managed to make its way into the computer systems of the NHS, which is Britain's public health system. And all of a sudden, you know, their systems are all but grinding to a halt. And you wonder why these things are allowed to occur. Could it be that because training has been taken out of the industry and because the education around security has been privatized and it's no longer about teaching wholesale security as a topic, it's more about let's get you certified in Microsoft, or let's get you certified in Linux, or, you know, so all of a sudden you're being trained to work in one particular silo that is actually actively discouraged from connecting to other non-proprietary forms of software. Yet you've got all of these systems that are linking up to each other that have to be able to read each other for the systems that we use for banking, for health, for national security. But the training that exists to protect all of these spaces doesn't exist in the form that it used to. And we're seeing these issues crop up across industries. And this in itself is a form of austerity, because when the funds aren't there to support the business model and you have to make cuts in order to remain profitable, it's inevitable that the ball is going to get dropped. And then you have to look at things like salaries. You know, mid-level salaries and junior salaries aren't what they used to be, and they certainly don't grow over time. And I wonder what that does to the quality of candidates that you get, and also encouraging people to stay in the job for a period of time. You know, most people my age will have 5 careers, maybe more, in their lifetime. And that's because they're not offered the longevity, they're not rewarded for their loyalty. And when they can't increase their earning potential over time, there's very little incentive to make sure that you're doing the job right. So all of these things are a product of austerity, and we really need to start looking at the dangers that this poses, not just to our economy and to our earning potential, but to our actual national security and to our safety. You know, we have really important information being stored in telecommunications companies, in hospitals, in intelligence agencies' databases, and we're not confident that they're secure. outside of putting food on our table, we've had allegations of Russian tampering in the election. How do we know that everything that we need to work safely and securely is being protected? We have no assurance that this exists. So these are the things I'm digging into. It's a very long-winded answer. I hope that's okay.
No, it's a phenomenal answer. I want to just touch on this though for a second, because you raised some concerns that I have, and that is, in the United States, we are constantly inundated with fears that our vote doesn't count, that our vote is it's more of a symbolic gesture to go through the motions, that the machines themselves, the technology backing them, are hacked, are ineffective. They are not actually registering. They're flipping them, whatever. And we had former Green Party presidential candidate David Cobb on with us last night, the Stein-Baraka campaign manager, who reiterated that and went through a rather lengthy series of options to ranked choice voting and representative democracy, basically allowing people to have representation regardless of whether they win or lose. That would be proportional representation, I believe is the proper term. But in the United States, we have a first past the post. You guys have a slightly different setup there in Australia. Can you talk a little bit about the election system, the technology, and perhaps the value of the vote in Australia as opposed to the United States?
Sure. I mean, I think there are some similarities and there are some differences. We work in a parliamentary sort of Westminster style system, except without the House of Lords and things like that. We still use a paper ballot, which I must say, I've never been more relieved to have. Australia, just as an aside, last year Australia attempted its first online census, and it was a debacle. Basically what happened is everyone had 24 to 48 hours to fill out an online survey for the first time, instead of actually having to fill out a booklet that is delivered to people's houses. And the company that was running the census, IBM, started to detecting people's logging in to the system as a DDoS attack. It basically recognized millions of you fill out the census as some sort of flood on the system, and decided that it was a hack and they needed to shut it down. And so there are fewer people that filled out the census last year than at any other time, because they couldn't get onto the system in the first place. And then the government had to scramble and try to get people to fill it out in the old school paper format. And I think, ironically, in this technologically driven age, we're starting to recognize the value of manual. So in Australia, voting is compulsory for a start. We fill out a paper ballot. I wouldn't go so far as to say that people enjoy voting, but it's certainly a bit of a cultural rite of passage. We have these really great sort of micro incentives. We call it a democracy sausage, because most voting ballots and voting booths will have charities set up that sell sausages and hot dogs, I guess is what you call them in the US, and different cake sales and cookies, and all of the money goes to charity. So, the idea is you get your vote and you get your sausage. So, even though voting is a giant pain in the ass, what do you do? But it's still, everyone kind of bands together to both enjoy and roll their eyes at this whole process, but they get a sausage at the end, and it's kind of this sort of form of nationalism that is really quite positive, I think. We do have a preference system. So while we don't have an electoral college, I should say, I guess we have a slightly similar system in that, everyone submits their ballot, and those ballots represent seats in different electorates, and the seats are based on the different populations in every state to ensure that the representation in New South Wales or Queensland or Victoria is representative to the amount of people that are voting and that live in the country at any one time. Outside of that, the different parties offer each other what are called preferences. And it basically means that it's a little complicated, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but say, for example, the Greens are never going to be in government, and they know that. But they want to make sure that they are as well positioned politically as they can possibly be. So they would cut a deal, say, with the Labor Party, and they would issue their preferences based on the seat allocation to say, we will allocate a certain amount of preferences to Labor, usually in exchange for X, Y, and Z. We don't ever really know why these preferences are given in a particular way. We don't really ever get to find out what deals have been done behind closed doors. But it could arguably be seen as a way of circumventing the power of the vote, because it means that they've taken our votes and they've done all of the counting and they've done some predictive analysis ahead of time about where these votes are going to land. And then they sort of conspire amongst themselves for the best political outcome. You can choose not to allocate preferences. And I believe last year, I could be wrong about this, so maybe I shouldn't be quoted on this, but I believe last year the Greens decided not to allocate preferences. But it's almost seen as kind of naive and foolish. There's this really great guy that you should get on the show. His name is Glenn Drury. He's called the Preference Whisperer. And he's one of the very few people in Australia who really understands how Australia's preference system works. And in doing so, has helped a bunch of different independent and micro parties gain power and gain seats, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. If you really want a true understanding of how it works, I really recommend you get him on the show, because he understands it more than any two people that I know.
You can help me.
I beg your pardon?
You can help me get him on.
Oh, happily. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk.
Great, fantastic.
So that's a little bit how it works. But, at least we don't have 12 guys in a room that inevitably end up electing our prime minister. It doesn't quite work like that. But, there are similarities, because the Electoral College and the preference system do have some qualities in common.
So I want to ask you a question, because we've spoken with Ian Dooley, and we've talked to various people, obviously from Australia, because we seem to have a great connection with you guys, at least through Real Progressives. And I want to keep building that, because it's wonderful to show that this movement that we're trying to bring about here is actually got global teeth to it. It's getting traction in more than just our little neck of the woods. And I'm trying to get our viewers to stop thinking only of the U.S., because if we're able to see the big picture, we understand how interrelated the things that we're doing are. And one of the things that came up to me is that, in Australia, you guys have a fairly robust, comparing it to the United States, you have a fairly robust public infrastructure. You have various services that you are given as citizens. I mean, you pay for them through your, I hate to say you pay for them through your tax, I know better, but the point is, the insinuation is there. You pay for them with your taxes. How does it work in Australia as far as healthcare goes, as far as other public services go? Because from what I've heard, America is big on exporting its exceptionalism, which is by definition neoliberal, and it destroys infrastructures wherever it goes. Have you been watching an erosion of public space there, or have you been watching? What is the state of it? How does it look? How does your public infrastructure work in Australia?
We are quite blessed for what used to be a quite robust social safety net, and to an extent, it is robust compared to the rest of the world. That being said, our government has made numerous attempts to roll it back. So we have a public health system known as Medicare, which I guess we do, like, as you say, pay for with our taxes, but kind of not, which we'll get into momentarily. But we also have private health. And just recently, I think it was less than a year ago, regulation was introduced where if you didn't have private health insurance, you paid a higher rate of tax. So the government is trying to incentivize people to move into a private system. That being said, every Australian has a Medicare card, and every Australian is entitled to a level of public health care. Public hospitals aren't necessarily in a great state. Some public hospitals are amazing in Australia. Some of them are just awful. The downside, as I'm sure you can imagine in the US, in being the public health system, if you need surgery, you could wait a really long time, and it might be too late by the time your name comes up. That being said, I would argue that while private health insurance is not responsive and it's tiered, so at least, I don't want to say all of the population, but a good portion of the population could arguably get access to the private health system and not have to suffer too greatly for it. If you have private health insurance, you can also claim it as a tax deduction and things like that. Our transport system is largely publicly owned, though parts of it have been privatized. For example, our ferry system in New South Wales and in Sydney was recently privatized. Part of our railway was privatized. So it's kind of a public-private partnership. We have quite a robust social safety net. We have welfare. It is continually tampered with, and it was recently cut. And the government is trying to introduce things like, you must accept the very first job that comes along, even if it's actually not going to support you in the way that it needs, and stuff like that. But thankfully, like the UK, the government is hanging on by like a seat or two. So thankfully, a lot of their legislation, they have to work a lot harder to get it across the board. So it means that without a mandate, their true neoliberal goals and ideologies have had a little dampener put on it by the opposition parties, which is great, thank goodness. The Labor Party was really, really successful in the last election. So while we have a Liberal government, as I said, they hang on by one seat. And what happened in Australia was actually quite similar to what happened to Theresa May in the UK. Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister, and our Treasurer, Scott Morrison, floated the idea of privatising Medicare. And, thankfully, most Australians are, they don't have the same problem with social safety net that many people do in the US and even in the UK. And things like Medicare and the social safety net are seen as a public right and a public good. And Labor did a really, really excellent job of running what was dubbed a Mediscare campaign. And the government had to get on the back foot and say, oh, no. Well, we're not privatizing Medicare. We're just privatizing the administration of Medicare, which is like, come on, like it's almost exactly the same. If you're privatizing the back end of Medicare, you're basically privatizing the system. So they never successfully got that across the board. That being said, particularly in the Indigenous community, we've seen real crackdown on welfare. We've seen the introduction of like welfare cards, where instead of like being able to either get like a cash handout or like a credit to your account, you're given basically like a debit card, and that card can only be used for certain things. And I guess it was argued, I hate even bringing this up, that it would discourage people from spending their money on things like drugs and alcohol. I want to say right now, I'm not of that camp.
Sure.
Just explaining the rhetoric. And they have been quite forthright in trying to involve themselves in how welfare should be handed out, particularly to the Indigenous community, but also to the working poor and to the unemployed. There have been real attempts to scale it back, but it's nowhere near what it's like in the US, and thank goodness for that. But what the Labor Party really needs to do now is to stop using the language of its opposition when it's trying to counter its arguments. You can't use the same argument as your enemy. Like, they're still basically using a neoliberal argument.
Can I interrupt you for one moment here? This is a really important point that you brought up. In the United States, obviously we have different set of parties, but very similar solutions, or similar rhetoric, if you will. And the Democratic Party has made a decision to try to emulate the Republican Party by saying all the same things. The only thing, we jokingly say the only difference is Democrats have better bedside manners. And I actually don't even think that's true anymore after watching the rigged primary, watching how defiant they've been in every way. They've been recalcitrant across the board. They're blocking single-payer health care. They are blocking meaningful moves to green energy. They are pushing fracking. They are pushing many things that are damaging to the environment. I quite frankly feel like they are the greater evil right now because we already know who the Republicans are, okay? But the Democrats have put themselves out there as if they are progressives. They've put themselves out there as if they're the left, and they couldn't be any further from the left. They're actually center-right in this country, and they are all about tough choices, eat your peas, take it on the chin. And when you understand some of the stuff that we're going to get into, I hope here in a few minutes, because we are running short on time, we have to discuss.
Sorry, I talk a lot.
No, it's beautiful. I'm so impressed. Claire, you have been a phenomenal guest. But one of the things that I want to make sure we touch on is money creation. We don't have to go too deep into this, but whenever a government that is monetarily sovereign claims to be broke, when it claims it needs to make cuts, once you're informed and you understand, you immediately know from Jump Street that you're dealing in a charade. We're not dealing in truth at that point. At that moment, everything else past that point, you've stopped hearing truth because they are positioning themselves to make a case that has nothing to do with reality. So as I hear you talk about them cutting the various safety nets in Australia that would still make us salivate in the U.S., okay, I watch us in the U.S. having folks like Ben Carson, Paul Ryan, a great many of these right-wingers who we finger point at and say, oh my God, they're so awful, and they are. But then I watch the same exact comments, the same exact logic coming out of the Nancy Pelosi's, the Dianne Feinsteins, even the Sherrod Browns. I mean, these are folks that you may or may not know in the U.S., but they are nonetheless people that have been put out there as leaders. And when you look at them and you say to yourself, what the hell are you talking about? And sadly, the millions, the masses, believe them, and they look at us like we're absolutely insane. Things we're saying, how could it possibly be that we could fully fund these programs, fully fund these hospitals, bring them up to speed, change the entire infrastructure so that it was robust and capable of meeting all of our needs? It's right there for the taking. But yet we don't believe that because we don't understand how money is created in monetarily sovereign nations. In your talks with Stephanie Kelton, your talks with Dr. Hale, and your talks with Ellis, et cetera, what have you garnered, especially as it pertains to Australian life, as to the impact of dollar creation or money creation and the net impact it has on the public space?
I have to Labor's credit, while I would argue they are, maybe centre-right, Bill Shorten, our opposition leader, has done a pretty spectacular job of bringing Labor back to its base. Labor was the party that helped create basically our offshore concentration camps in Manus Island in Nauru, where people fleeing civil war and political and religious persecution find themselves basically, almost in a gulag with no cause for repeal and very little form of, processing of their applications. That being said, Labor is now driving their campaign called Bring Them Here, and they've recognized the error of their ways, and they're finally starting to act like a true opposition party. For example, they fought to save Medicare is another area. They're very connected with the unions, and they are now slowly beginning to understand what happens, not just when jobs disappear, but when the jobs that exist, their wages have been stagnant, or if not, actually going backwards. We had a situation where the union for casual workers at Baker's Delight, which is like a little bakery in Australia, basically conspired with the Liberal Party to have all of their employees sign new contracts, 0-hour contracts, and taking a pay cut for a job that they already had. It's pretty terrible. So Labor has slowly been returning to its centre. That being said, it's still not confident in its economic language. And to be fair, words like monetary sovereign do sound a little loony if you don't understand what it means. And I think that's probably part of the weakness of MMT. And I try to avoid using languages like that. What I would say to people who are new to this is that if the government is printing its own currency, no one else is allowed to print the Australian dollar except for the Australian government. Same in the US. No one can print the US dollar except for the US. That would be counterfeiting. So when you're lending to yourself in your own currency, the only person that you owe is yourself. And so long as that money being spent is going towards things that will then in itself generate jobs as a form of almost profit, basically, that spending will pay for itself almost immediately. It's not going to take a generation to pay back. And if it does, they haven't done the right job. We really need to start to work with political parties to help them get the confidence to speak to their constituents. Our former treasurer, Wayne Swan, just earlier this year, floated the idea of a job guarantee. And that's almost contrary to what anyone, in the Labor opposition party has spoken about. And, he brought it up. He did a really excellent job of explaining it, but it hasn't really been picked up by the party. Equally, our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, came out just a number of months ago and said that the neoliberal policies that he himself implemented had run their course, and basically admitted that maybe he made a mistake and apologized for it. And for a former Prime Minister to come and say, I was wrong, and we need to rethink what it is that we're doing, I mean, that's a big deal in and of itself, but it gives me confidence that the Labor Party is beginning to understand what they need to do. But now we need to help them understand a different economic language. Unfortunately, I think they feel that if they speak to people on neoliberal terms, that gives people confidence, because neoliberalism has been such a successful ideology and it has been so successfully implemented. And I'll say this, I think part of the reason that it has been so successful is that there has been a public consensus across a group of different ideologies and people who have vastly different ideas about how the world should work, but they've had the decency not to air their dirty laundry in public, and they've decided to have a consensus on the top line of how neoliberalism works, and so they all speak off the same page, out of the same playbook, using the same language, even though the things that they believe ideologically couldn't be more different. For example, libertarians, for example, they just want to be allowed to do what they can within the bounds of the law without the interference of the state. They believe that, maybe there's perhaps too much regulation around things like, like drug use, for example. And then there are people, like Donald Trump or, the alt-right who are associated with the KKK and who want a different legal system for people who are brown or African American, and libertarians and the KKK have almost nothing in common, but they're yet still speaking off the same economic playbook. I really wish people that are left of center would stop arguing amongst themselves and just start to learn how to get on the same page, because we look like a joke when we argue amongst ourselves. I think we need to start to accept our differences and have those conversations privately. And we really need to start to unpack what it is that we've gotten wrong about the economy and what the real remedy is for that. So first step, language. Second step, consensus. Third step, it would be good if more of us could work in some form of consultation with governments and political parties, unions. Even, there's groups like Get Up, which I guess is like an activist group designed to hold both forms of government, the left and the right, to account. We really need to start to look less disorganized and start to work together. That's my 2 cents.
No, and that's beautiful. And you know what? I don't even think that I could end this any better. I think that was great. Do you have any closing words? Because first off, let me apologize for those of you who don't know this. I owe Claire things. I owe Claire some stuff. And I've been so tied up with trying to get real progressives together, because attrition is a terrible thing in the volunteer world. And I am the guy who wears many, many hats. When the volunteers leave, we have to find replacements. And I am like, So I owe you stuff, and I promise you I will get you stuff. But I want to say something real quickly. I have not had this much of an opportunity to speak with you. We've chatted some throughout Facebook. Obviously, we have some shared friends. But I am begging you to please come back on more often because you are a breath of fresh air and someone who I am so impressed with. I fanboy sometimes, but I promise you there is nothing but truth in my statements here.
You were so nice. Thank you, Steve. I'm so impressed with what you're doing too, and I think you have a really important role to play in correcting the errors that have led us to this terrifying and confusing moment in history. And yes, you do owe me things, so get me those things on deadline. But I would just encourage people to come to renegadeinc.com. I also have a subscription newsletter called Hello Humans. You can find that on my Patreon, patreon.com/hello_humans. You can find me on Twitter, _Claire Connelly. You can find me on Facebook, same deal. Please have me on again, because as you can tell, I talk quite a lot and I have a lot to say, so I would love to be back on.
Well, can I be mean for a minute? Sort of mean. It's not mean. It's really actually devilishly good. But I kind of had said I would really, really like to have Claire run a show on Real Progressives sometime.
Oh, I would like that.
I would
yes,
like
please.
too. So we will talk. Let's talk.
Let's talk. Let's talk.
All right. We will talk. So Claire Connelly, thank you so much for joining us at Real Progressives. Folks, I want to thank you all for joining us again. Please join us tomorrow night with Joe Firestone. Of course, you have me with Ellis on Sunday night as well. In the meantime, Trish and Keith will be doing our vegan show here at 9:15 Eastern Standard Time. Please stick around, learn something. I'm Steve Grumbine. Claire, thank you so much again. Have a great night, everyone.
Always a pleasure.